In this video, we will cover a new demonstration introduced in MR6.1 of Citrix SD-WAN demo environment found in Citrix Demo Center. Particularly, we will be covering how we can leverage a script to create a full configuration simply using API. In your provisioned environment, you should open up the interface to SD-WAN Center. You will also need to open up the interface to the MCN and just leverage the username and password provided in your provision email. Additionally, you can log in and open up the interface to our Apache Guac server so that you can get access to some of the VMs that are in the environment. Particularly, we're going to look at the API script tool. So if we look at our network topology of the respective devices, we have our SD-WAN center management IP connected to the LAN network in our data center. We're going to also leverage the DC SD-WAN. This is the MCN, again, the management IP, and interface is connected directly to the LAN network, the internal DC network. And we're also going to leverage the API tool, also connected to the internal DC network. So they're all sitting on the same subnet, and the API script will communicate with the SD-WAN center as well as the MCN to create configuration using the configuration editor. Open up an SSH access to the API script tool, and if we look in this directory, there is a Perl script that can be used as a sample to show you how to create configuration using API calls. The other files in the directory are simple outputs of that file. So if we look into that file, we can see the input values, and here you can define the IP address of the management of either the SD-WAN center or the IP address of the MCN, the management IP of the MCN. And these are using the private IP addresses of that internal DC network. Now, if you're going to create the configuration on SD-WAN center, you can define it as a 1 here. And by default, the environment will be provisioned like this, as well as input the proper username and password. Now, by changing this to a 0, that means that the script will actually call the MCN to build the configuration. So by default, it's going to communicate with our SD-WAN center. So if we go to SD-WAN center configuration, network configuration, so the configuration editor here, we can see that there is the default demo SD-WAN configuration that the system comes with, but there's also a example CFG SME config that is empty. So what we're going to do in this script is perform API calls to build that network. And here you can define how many RCNs, the number of regions, the number of sites per region, as well as the appliance models that are being used. There's also definition of how you want to define your interface groups, the respective fields that are available for the interface groups, as well as the IPs that you would like to use. And you can update these fields as needed. Then the script also provides a table to define your WAN links. And again, it gives you input options to define leveraging templates, leveraging specific IP addresses that you would like to use, as well as the physical rates for upload and download per link. It also goes into defining routing domains, defining internet service, defining routing protocol, defining auto path groups. But you can look at this Perl script in more detail as needed. But to demonstrate the functionality, we'll go in and execute this Perl script. And again, what it's going to do is communicate with SD-WAN center by default, take this existing file name, examples_CFG_SME, automatically populate it using the API calls with the respective sites defined in that script. Okay, so we'll go back to our SSH access and issue the executable. And it will output as it's going along and running through the various steps its success in creating and defining the sites, the WAN links, the interface groups, internet services, applications, autopath groups, all the various definitions within the script. So this script can be used as a sample to showcase how to leverage APIs to create a configuration, an SD-WAN configuration ranging from 2 sites to 2,500 sites. This was actually developed leveraging a common customer configuration and replicating that configuration build out instead of using the web interface and the configuration editor, using API calls to replicate the same activities. Now, when the configuration is complete, it will output a summary of how long it took to execute, as well as the total number of API calls and a breakdown of the API calls per MCN, per RCN, per site. It also will provide a summary of the total sites that were added, and then the total number of WAN links, and an average of the time to execute per site. So about 16 seconds to create a site, which includes the site, the LAN, the WAN, etc. Okay. Now, when we go to our configuration, we can go back in and open that configuration again. And now it's no longer just an empty site. We can see that the API call has successfully created an MCN, a geo MCN, creating 2 RCNs. So it created 2 regions and 2 RCNs and defining 2 sites per RCN. Additionally, we can look at the global tab and see where the configuration was defined in terms of the regions added, routing domains created, application objects that were defined using those API calls, a virtual path default set that was created. Script covers about 80 to 90% of potential API calls that are available on SD-WAN Center and SD-WAN devices. There are certain missing features that are still being added, so the team is continuously adding additional API calls that are currently lacking. So definitions of DHCP server capability, that's yet to be added, so we can expect that in future releases. But the script does add other common inputs that are used in creating sites, like autopath groups, WAN link definitions, site build-outs, etc. And then you can take this configuration and add the missing component, DHCP server, on the respective sites, as well as any advanced functions and features that are available. Now, if we go to our MCN, open up the web interface to the MCN, we can look at the configuration editor. So since the environment is being managed by SD-WAN Center, there is no active configurations available when you provision your environment. However, we can also leverage this tool and edit the IP to reflect that of our MCN. So our MCN is 200.150. So we'll just update that IP address. We also will tell the script that we are no longer using the SD-WAN Center, and everything else is the same. So it uses those variables to make sure that the script knows who it's calling in the API configuration. Okay, so we'll just save that file, mark it as an executable, and then issue that command again. And now, instead of logging into the SD-WAN Center, it is now logging into the MCN and creating the same configuration. Now, one of the differences between the MCN and the SD-WAN Center is that currently with 10.2, the SD-WAN Center does not have the API to create a configuration file. So that's why the demo environments will create that configuration file and have that configuration file available ahead of time, but have it empty. Now with the MCN, that API call is there to create that file name. So that device, we don't need to have that file available. But for SD-WAN Center, you can have that file name available as an empty file, and then let the API call build the configuration for that file name. All right, so we'll let that execute. Okay, so we've sped up the video and the script outputs the total time used to execute the API calls and the breakdown of the number of API calls on an average per site basis. So we could go to our DC MCN and open the configuration, and again, the script automatically created that configuration file name and performed the operations of adding the various components within the site. So then we can audit that configuration and further create additional and more advanced functionalities that potentially may be missing in the API calls currently, and further define the configuration, save it, and perform the export to push it out, and maybe update IP addresses as needed. But that script provides a sample of capabilities that the solution has in regards to API and can be modified and distributed as needed. So in addition to that, one thing to point out, I'll just open up a new Apache Guac connection, and on the AD virtual machine, you can find that Perl script available to distribute as needed and to review and maybe copy it onto your own personal devices. On that AD, there's also a Postman application where you can kind of test some of the API calls that are available in the SD-WAN devices. And it provides a very basic sample of SD-WAN login. And it's using the management IP and the proper directory to create the session cookie. And also, you can run and create some get commands to, in this case, we're getting the change management output. So you can test your API calls here to make sure that they are valid. And there's the logout command. And there's also a sample one for SD-WAN Center to be able to log in and execute. In this case, it's getting a inventory status. Okay, so that's there to play around with. So in summary, we have the ability in Demo Center to showcase a sample script that can be used to generate configuration for an SD-WAN deployment. And that script can be leveraged as an example or a sample to reference by anyone to create these API calls to these devices. And you can always find the latest list of API per device, leveraging the configuration Nitro API page. So you can download that doc, and depending on what software version is running on that device, that doc will be updated with the latest API calls that are specific to that version. And on SD-WAN Center, Nitro API tab will provide you a similar doc, but specifically the API calls that can be used for SD-WAN Center.